Hello and welcome along to COP30 Covered, the daily podcast show from Edie's award-winning editorial team, where we're bringing you all the latest news and views from the 2025 Climate Summit in Brazil. So, which countries are supporting a popular new fossil fuel transition roadmap? Who is blocking mentions of biodiversity in the negotiations? And when will the ministers come back? We explain everything in 45 minutes or less per episode. Yes, this is episode 6 now of COP30 Covered from Edie. You're listening to the voice of Edie's content editor, Sarah, on Friday the 14th of November 2025. Joining me in our virtual podcast studio today are our editor, Matt Mace.
Hello.
And our senior reporter, Siddy Mitchell.
Hello.
Hi both. How are we all holding up? Matt, I think the last time I came to you, you were a bit like, I'm creaking, I'm tired. Have things improved?
Yeah, it's Friday, isn't it? It's like the weekend, except we've got to work over the weekend and it's miserable weather. So it's all fun, all good. No, I think in all seriousness, it's not bad at all. COP's keeping us very busy, but at times like this, there's like pros and cons to being out there or covering it remotely. And the cons to covering it remotely are you can feel very detached from what's happening out there, and it's a struggle to keep up with the mood on the grounds. But hearing the kind of problems and logistics around food availability, weather, humidity, and just the general kind of logistical nightmare of COP, I think I'm quite happy to be in my office covering this, even if I'm a little bit cold.
Yeah, I heard from someone earlier today that one of their closest contacts essentially had booked into one of these temporary shipping container hotels in Belém, but the health and safety came to visit it around halfway through this week and declared it uninhabitable. So that's a whole week and a half's worth of accommodation payments just gone out the window. So I'm glad I'm at home. How are you, Siddy?
Just on like vibes, I was speaking to someone earlier this morning for a podcast, which our listeners will get to, in a couple of weeks. But yeah, she was there in Belém earlier last week for like the World Leader Summit and stuff like that, and she was telling me that the vibes felt good. That everybody there was like positive, and it felt like the conversation was shifting to action. Everybody felt energized to act on whatever had been agreed at COP28, COP29. So that was kind of the vibe. It just feels good to hear that. I know, our team, we're not there in person, but when you hear this, that's the kind of stuff that you don't get to see over in emails or over Teams. So that's been great. But otherwise, as Matt said, COP is keeping us busy. And while some could argue not a lot has come out, at the same time, a lot has happened still the first week. So, yeah, it's busy.
Yeah, it definitely feels like, as you say, we've not got everything about the full agenda yet. We'll probably know more during and after the weekend, but it doesn't seem like we've reached a lull or a complete roadblock, and there hasn't been a huge fight in the corridors from what I've heard, which has always been good. And we've talked quite top level there about some logistics and some vibes, but Siddy, I'd like to come to you for our top of the COPs. So our news in brief for today, please.
Yes. So to start with, momentum is growing behind a new roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels, which was a goal agreed at COP28 in Dubai. Brazil tabled the idea, and so far it's gotten support from a couple of countries, including Denmark, the UK, Germany, France, Kenya, Mexico, South Korea, and South Africa. So well-dispersed group of countries, but some of the on-the-ground sources and the posts that I've seen on LinkedIn, they're saying that there are other groups emerging. So the Arab group led by Saudi Arabia and the like-minded group led by India and China. And they do not want to address this emissions gap and what was agreed at COP28, but want to wait until 2028 when the formal global stocktake is due. So that's interesting. And then just staying on fossil fuels for a second, a new survey from Quick Pointers Out has found that there are more than 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP. So it uses the term to describe policymakers from supporting nations, business representatives, and trade body representatives. It also includes trade bodies on carbon capture and emissions as well. And while this number is fewer than those who attended the past two COPs, it's still a large proportion of attendees. So like 1 in 25 people there you could argue have vested interest, or favor fossil fuels. So that's about the fossil fuels. But I think another area where I can see conversation shift is nature. And, when we started COP30, I think the thing that most countries focus on is like the interlink between climate and nature action, and how it's important to talk about both simultaneously for effective impact. But observers have noted that Saudi Arabia is striving to remove any mention of biodiversity from the official negotiating text, and it is arguing that nature issues should be saved for the biodiversity and desertification COPs instead, which is, quite opposite of the mindset that leaders had when they came to Belém, which was the interlink between climate and nature action, and how, Brazil is the right place to kind of emphasize that, echo that, given the backdrop of Amazon. So a lot has changed, if you look at it from when the COP started.
And there's still time for it to change. So the thematic focus on things like agriculture, nature and forests actually doesn't begin until next week. So there's still time for things to change around the language there. Still time for more funding to be put into the new Tropical Forest Forever facility too. But looking at the themes for today before we get ahead of ourselves. So we're now on to our third sort of pair of themes. Among today's themes are energy, industry, transport, trade, finance, carbon markets and non-CO2 gases. So this is always a hotly anticipated part of the COP, and these themes too tend to permeate across the whole 2 weeks. There's a lot to discuss here, so we'll be focusing on the finance aspect today and the energy transition tomorrow. So finance always talked about massively at COP, not always huge amount of agreements or agreements that are needed, and added complications for the context of 2025, I think. But Matt, do give us a primer on today's topic.
Yeah, I think finance is a good way. Everyone always says it's hard to make climate change kind of resonate personally, depending on where you are. And obviously the UK feels the effects of climate change, but not as much as others. But I think finance is actually a good way to showcase the kind of problem, in the sense that we know that there's a big funding gap between what is required and what we get, and I'm sure many people feel that in their own personal pay packet. What they get and what they need is quite squeezed right now in terms of the cost of living crisis. It's exacerbated at a global level. The UN estimates that achieving all of the SDGs in full, which COP is very much a part of trying to do, will require $4.2 trillion per year. And that sounds like an awful lot, and it is, but it's actually only 1% of global wealth, which means that a realignment could make that doable. In terms of climate specifically, it's 1.8 trillion per year, probably at least. And that's going to be largely focused on mitigation efforts, and $310 billion for adaptation. That's 12 times the amount of public money that was spent on adaptation in 2023. And I think the perception has always been that COP funnels public finance into climate, and it's clear that that's not going to be enough. And it's becomes a case of who pays what and how, and most of it's provided in loans, which just creates more debt for the kind of most vulnerable countries as well. And COPs have started to look at how philanthropic and private finance can support the public finance aspect of it. And I saw something absolutely bonkers today, Sarah, which you sent to me from The Guardian and Carbon Brief, which is a great bit of research they've done into the 22-23 funding from the developed nations into what's meant to go to the most vulnerable nations via that 100 billion climate goal, which gets discussed at every COP and has been since 2009. And they found that only like 20% of that finance went to the 44 most vulnerable countries. And you had countries like China and UAE and Saudi Arabia getting, billion-dollar loans to invest in renewables. So there's something going wrong with the accounting and delivery aspect of it all. It's all a bit messy. So the negotiation delegations have their work cut out to get finance not just up to levels it needs, but actually going to the right places.
Yeah, it's definitely like a big, thorny, complex issue, and that's always what people fight about. They're always fighting about who should pay in, who should get out. and where should it go. So I'm not going to try and solve all of that by myself, and I'm also not going to try and solve the question of, how much is public, how much is private. This is some of the stuff that we touch on in our special guest interview today. So earlier today, I spoke to James Hooton, who is Managing Director of Missions at the Green Finance Institute. I think that's a really cool job title. The Institute itself was set up 6 years ago by the UK government and the City of London Corporation, so the government and the sort of finance sector in London. It was made shortly after we legislated for net zero by 2050 to map ways of catalysing private finance and public finance for that transition. And from that beginning in the UK, it's grown significantly with a global presence that includes quite a big Brazil programme now as well. So I spoke to James, who told me he's just back from the pre-COP Business and Finance Summits in Sao Paulo. So he has some interesting takeaways about the presence of private finance there this year, after months of headline-grabbing retreats from some of the biggest Wall Street financiers. So without further ado, here is that interview with James in full. Thank you very much for your time, James.
Thank you, Sarah. No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what we're doing. It's been a really busy week last week, and I've handed over the baton to our CEO, who's in Belém this week with our in-country director.
Great. And before we sort of dive into a bit about what the Institute is doing this week, it would probably be great to recap on Sao Paulo. What were you there for, and how did you find it?
It was good. It was buzzing with a lot of organisations, both private and public. A lot of representation from LATAM and North America. Our work, particularly last week, was focused on the Brazilian investment platform. So we're a formal partner of that platform, and so we are looking to bring the priority projects that are aligned under that platform to FID, to financial investment decision. And so we spend a lot of time working with green cement and other users, looking to get their projects to bankability, and then working with the ministries around what challenges that entails.
Got it. And as you've already probably touched on, the Institute works across a really wide range of topics, from green manufacturing to clean energy to nature. But for those who are listening that maybe aren't familiar with the GFI, it'd be great to have a potted introduction.
Thanks. Yeah, so I lead our sector and geographic specific work at the Green Finance Institute, and we're a global organisation that works to bridge the execution gap that exists between the ambitions of private finance to execute transactions and governments who want to create those transitions. So our work really has one outcome that we're looking to give, and that is the crowding in of private finance. And we do that by working across the ecosystem to align the various incentives and co-design the financial mechanisms that will allow that to happen. We do that work across 9 different countries and 6 different sectors, as you alluded to. We are philanthropically funded, so that enables us to be a neutral broker in those conversations. We're not playing anyone's particular interests or book. We're really just trying to get that private finance crowded in to create the economy that is good for climate and nature and people. And what really differentiates us, I would say, is our transactions to transitions approach. So we've created a scalable, what we call a global investment greenprint, that creates investment plans that connect both country demand with investment supply. We do that by aligning policy and development capital and pipeline development. So the approach creates deals, but also creates institutional approaches that enable those deals to be replicated and scaled across the priority sectors and geographies that we work in.
Got it. And with that design and mission in mind, I assume that COPs are usually quite a big moment in the calendar. So I'd love to explore sort of how you approach COPs and what your priorities are for COP30 specifically.
Yeah, our approach to COP is to demonstrate that transactions to transitions approach and how that's scalable, particularly. We've talked about, you've seen the independent high-level expert group on climate finance talking about the $1.3 trillion of climate finance that's required, and that we're trying to get to that number by 2035. The high-level expert group has identified recently that half of that needs to come from private finance, and obviously the more that can come from private finance, the better. And so our priorities really at COP are to demonstrate how that works. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So as we talked last week in Sao Paulo, we were meeting with a green cement producer that's looking for $50 million worth of capital. They're looking to replace coal in their cement production with a gasifier that, and I'll just a little bit technical, but I won't go too deep, but a gasifier that uses non-recyclable waste materials like plastic and biomass and hospital waste to heat the kiln to create the cement. So there's a real greenhouse gas reduction story there. But it's not as simple in terms of getting them to FID, to getting them to actually get the 50 million that they require, because there are plastic feedstock challenges, there are gating fee landfill challenges within Brazil as a country, as there are in other countries, that actually incentivize plastic to go to landfill rather than to go to these technologies. So rather than it just being about the sort of the capital stack of that company and how we get that company financed, it's actually a broader conversation across Brazilian ministry, across the industry, across finance and the various players. So how do we align those incentives to get that transaction to actual financial close? And that's a transaction that is a priority transaction under the Brazilian investment platform. The point being is once you've got that transaction to financial close, the work that you've done, the enabling environment, the mechanisms that you've created, are they de-risking mechanisms, the mandates that you've put in place around plastic flow, for instance, they're not deal specific. So other deals, other green cement producers using this technology can then come to the table, can come to the market. And so thereby that transaction then demonstrates the pathway to the transition. So our first priority has really been doing that work last week and demonstrating that and having those conversations, with Brazilian ecosystem to get that off the ground, particularly for green cement and that industrial decarbonisation story. The second piece then is happening tomorrow on Saturday the 15th. We're launching alongside the World Bank, the finance mission of the Global Clean Power Alliance. So this is very much a demand and country-led program. So we're looking at clean energy generation across, at the moment, the 5 countries that have signed up. So we have Chile and Mozambique, and Colombia and others. And that's around how do we get private finance into clean power generation in those countries. So making sure that their investment plans that they've got are investable from a private finance perspective. And it's important that work is alongside the World Bank, who have that public finance arm. And obviously we have the sort of the voice and the private finance sector with us to scale those clean energy investments. According to the IEA, clean energy investments need to double in advanced economies by the early 2030s, but they need to rise 6-fold in emerging and developing economies, 6-fold. So that's what we're looking to catalyze. So we're launching that, and our work then kicks off in earnest, following that. So it's really about showing how private finance can come to the table.
And I wanted to get your view on whether private finance really is at the table at this COP. So we've had a year in which, people are withdrawing from voluntary global climate initiatives. Some of these initiatives have folded completely over mainly political headwinds from the US. But as you mentioned, countries are increasingly leaning on private finance to do their heavy lifting, and there are increasingly the mechanisms and the models for blended finance and for innovative finance. So looking to where we are at this COP, is private finance really stepping up? What are you getting in terms of the feel of finance's voice at the COP?
Finance is absolutely ready to step up, and the voice is there. There's a little bit of wait and see, but the voice is absolutely there. So yes, specifically in terms of some of the companies that we've been speaking to last week in Sao Paulo, private finance is there. They're looking at how do we lean in. You want equity, you want debt, how do we provide that to you? And what are the risks that we need to work through? And you're right, we've seen the big tent commitments that show they are ready to step up. The problem with the challenge there is there's no plan to implement. Right, so we are asking countries now for NDCs, and we're really then scrutinising what those NDCs look like in terms of credibility and implementability. You had Anil Dasgupta on, I think, in one of your previous episodes that talked about that. Absolutely, very, very rightly so. But we need to see that. What is that plan for private finance as well? And I think in the past we've equated climate risk with finance risk and hoped that sort of equation would then allow finance just to flow. But climate risk is not the same as finance risk. Right? Climate risk is unevenly and unjustly spread across the globe. Finance risk is very place-based, very project-based, very transaction-based. Now, that doesn't mean that climate cannot be a part of the economic transition. And I know the Brazilian presidency is absolutely looking to centre climate at the heart of an economic transition. It can do. But what that means is that we need to create the markets and create the opportunities for those risk-adjusted returns that private finance is looking for. Finance is the facilitator of the transition, policy is the enabler, and our work is therefore really to demonstrate that if we can have one foot in the public camp, co-designing the markets and the mechanisms that are required, and then 1 foot in the private camp. They're making sure that what's been designed and co-designed, right, they're at the table, and therefore there's an investable proposition at the end of that process. I think is really important. And so private finance are very much there, but let's work through what that plan and what those mechanisms are to get it to flow.
And you've already touched on some specific kinds of finance related to, as you say, the energy transition in industry and financing clean energy generation in EMTEs. But I think we'd be remiss as well not to talk about nature finance. So this is the Amazon COP. Everyone's talking about forest finance. So I understand that nature finance is something that the GFI has done a lot of work on recently and between the COP. So it would be great to recap on some of that as well.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we do quite a lot of work on nature finance. We have some really excellent partners that we work with, particularly UNDP, Biofin and UNFFI. And I think really our work is very much focused on the demand side. We see the biggest gap as that demand side. And we do really, the work that we do on that is on 2 areas. First is the collective action models that you see. So how do we unlock capital from businesses that need to develop resilient supply chains and operations? And a great example of that is the work that's been done on the Fishery Improvement Fund. So that's where you have businesses that are buying fish from fisheries and understanding that that fishery needs to be resilient in order to maintain the supply chain that those businesses need. And so those businesses are willing to put an extra cost per kilogram onto the fish that they're buying from those fisheries. And that extra cost aggregated across all those businesses then creates an extra income stream for that fishery that then goes on to sustainable practices like better gear, workers' rights, time spent. You can have downtime spent moving the fishery from one location to a nearby location to create, maintain balance in the ecosystem. And so those collective action models that we're seeing across fishery improvement funds, we're seeing it elsewhere as well, are really getting businesses involved in, but that's not private finance, that's private sector, private businesses involved in financing those resilient supply chains. The second one I would point out is around compliance markets, like mitigation banking, that are able to unlock demand. So mitigation banking, where governments typically have set aside areas for restoration. So mitigation banking enables developers of, let's say, infrastructure or energy projects to offset their environmental impacts by purchasing credits from those pre-established banks that restore and enhance things like wetlands or streams or endangered species. In the US, which I think, if I'm not wrong, represents about 3/4 of the market at the moment, this is what we're looking to scale. In the US, there's over $3.5 billion of private investment per year into these mitigation banks. And that's over 625,000 hectares of wetlands and streams and species. There's 53,000 jobs involved in that. And so this is a real private market investment opportunity that that enables restoration of these wetlands, creates jobs, and I think creates money to flow. And that's the US. And I think the work that we're doing is scaling those with governments across the globe. We have biodiversity net gain in the UK, and we're looking to replicate things like that across the globe. So there's real momentum there.
Yeah, it definitely feels like something a few years ago that nature finance and nature policy was a bit, of conceptual. And it seems now that we have some of the frameworks and it's actually moving a little bit more in the real world.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's that sort of we talked about collaboration before and connectedness, but we needed coordination. That ultimately is the coordination is what we need, and particularly with nature finance, when you're looking to create revenue streams, cash flows, it creates that coordination because the benefits of nature restoration are very widespread, but need to be targeted at those that ultimately need to pay for it and they need to use it. And so actually connecting those different dots takes somebody to sit in the middle and do that sort of systems level coordination, which is the work that we do with a number of excellent partners to make sure that has the outcome that's desired.
Makes complete sense. And James, we could probably do, another 20 minutes just on nature finance, but we're nearly at the end of the time that we have together today. So I wanted to ask, essentially, as you said, we're still at a case of wait and see with a lot of aspects of the COP at this halfway point now, but I'd love to get your COP wish list. So what would make this a successful COP for you?
I think the top of the list, and you talked about the political headwinds, I'd love to see the political will aligning behind this COP, what the roadmap looks like, particularly around adaptation. and particularly around how do we get from the 300 billion of climate finance committed to the 1.3 trillion. For me, but the overarching point there is that political will behind that, and then how does that then translate into something that we can actually work with? So for me, when we're working with these project sponsors on the ground, creating these transactions that move into transitions, across the geographies that we're working in, the emerging and developing economies, that 1.3 trillion is how that's deployed through multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, and the like, is absolutely key to us to be able to lean on that concessional capital to create the risk sharing mechanisms that then allow private capital to flow. So for me, the first thing is that political will. If we see that political will, then we can then move into what that implementation looks like across those specific bits, adaptation and that climate finance piece. And I think if we see that, then I think we can start to move quicker.
Well, it does feel like it's shaping up to be a bit of a roadmap COP, and we could have anticipated that coming in based on what the presidency said. So fingers crossed for the week ahead. But for today, James, that's all the time we've got on this particular episode. So thank you very much for joining us on COP30 Covered.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Big thank you once again to James for his time. And as he mentioned, it's been a big day for the GFI at the COP. It partnered with the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Programme for the new roadmap on high quality energy investment planning. So at the moment, emerging and developing economies are only taking about 15% of the world's clean energy financing share. So this framework aims to provide a way forward from that and rebalancing it. And it's not just a paper. Programs have already been agreed with the Union of African Nations, the Caribbean region, Chile, Colombia and Mozambique. And early engagement is already underway with Morocco and Tanzania as well. So watch this space. As we've said, lots more to come over the weekend. So although the normal working week is coming to a close, COP only has one rest day, which is Sunday the 16th of November. So our podcast schedule is going to mirror that. There is going to be a episode tomorrow all about the practicalities of the energy transition. So we've touched on that landmark pledge to treble renewables by 2030, but what are the complexities of achieving that? How do we get the grid ready, the supply chains ready, and the people ready? So that's what we'll be tackling on COP30 Covered tomorrow. In the meantime, you can check out all of our written COP coverage on edie.net. Once again, we're at edie.net. So you can expect detailed explainers, breaking news stories, and daily roundups of the news in brief. There's also information on there on how to follow up on the COP with our post-COP debrief webinar that we're hosting with Ecology on November 25th. So you can register for that free session by heading to edie.net and looking at the events and webinars tag. But for the meantime, we're into the first weekend of COP. We made it, guys.
Well, I'll do a whoop on Saturday. I'll whoop. I know I'm not in the actual podcast tomorrow, but I'll whoop in spirit when that's done because we get the rest day. So
yeah, I'd like to think that you're going to do it literally on midnight. That at midnight I'll just hear echoes from a few villages over, Matt.
Yeah, I've got my party popper and my countdown ready.
The fireworks are over, so if you hear anything, it really is just Matt. But yeah, for this episode, that really is everything. Thank you so much for joining us, listeners, on COP30 Covered for this first week of the summit. For this episode, it's a goodbye from Matt.
Goodbye.
A goodbye from Siddy.
Goodbye.
And a goodbye from me. Goodbye.